If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review The Guide to the Camarilla, a sourcebook for Vampire the Masquerade. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. Just over a year ago at the time of recording, we had a look at the Camarilla and Anarch books for Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition. Those who have listened to those episodes 86 and 87 of the Law by Night podcast, will know that I feel that both books did not live up to their full potential. What was provided was useful, if rather fleeting and incredibly vague, ultimately serving as interesting coffee table books. Whilst they were flawed and disappointing tomes, at least they provided some small and minor elements for both storytellers and players. Sabbat the Black Hand was, in my opinion, a disorganised, contradictory mess from start to finish that failed to progress the Sword of Cain in any meaningful manner beyond the boring bite, stab, kill, slurp stereotype, as I explored in fuller detail in my review of that book at the tail end of March 2022, which was a few months ago as of the recording of this episode. Those, however, are not the only source books for those three sects, as you may have gathered by the title of this episode. 3 books were released for the revised edition of Vampire the Masquerade. The first of these, Guide to the Camarilla, was released on February 1999 that was meant to serve as the definitive guide to the Camarilla, providing its function, history, secrets, and organisation as seen through the eyes of its major clans. It is a pretty big claim, and someone has to test that statement, and of course, that person just so happens to be me. Does this claim hold up, and can and should newer players and storytellers for newer installments of Vampire the Masquerade use this for their sessions? But before we dive into the book review proper, here are the rules to the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics, and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you're right and I'm wrong, and vice versa. A good place to start with anything is at the beginning, which has the start of the physical book itself, which currently sits neatly upon my lap. It is a letter-sized hardback book with the infamous green marble pattern like practically every Vampire the Masquerade book before then and everything else in the V20 line after it. It is made of a slightly squishy hardback sort of material, like some sort of cardboard perhaps, that is somewhat harder than its vanilla counterpart, but it is a tome that will mark easily all the same. Being a source book, it is also much smaller than any accompanying core book. On the front cover, we have a moodily, perhaps romantic goth scene of kindred at Elysium in some misty church somewhere. Members of various clans, beautifully illustrated, can be found clustered around together. A suited and booted Venture at the centre, presumably on one knee. A Toreador in a white dress and a bouquet of roses, and a taller figure behind her holding a shotgun. A figure I'm assuming is Theo Bell, a Brujah Archon. On either side of the three, we have some other vampires, mostly Nosferatu, which makes this little monster fucker very happy. This of course sits on top of the infamous green marble that is Vampire the Masquerade, with a poorly scanned in version of the blurb straight onto the back, with the ye old revised Camarilla arc in the centre, which is stylised as if it was part of the green marble. The front cover itself is not centred, going a bit too far over to the right, which is something that irritates me greatly. I will mention at this point that, like most of my TTRPG purchases, my copy of Guide to the Camarilla came from DriveThruRPG, which is worth noting because the printing of much of the artwork and cover on my copy is a little off. The varied black and white art style pieces depicting vampires and their nightly activities are very striking, yes, but these scanned in pieces of artwork are not very clear, some more blurry than others. Similar comments can be passed regarding the formatting of the pages and text. I am assuming by the white borders around some of the pages meant that original copies of the book were slightly smaller than what I own currently. Just something to look out for when you purchase copies on DriveThruRPG. That said, the art found at the beginning of each chapter is purely stunning, almost with a seductive noir feel in places. When you open the book and read the opening story, you are greeted with the introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover and what you will find inside. It starts by setting up the premise that the Sabbat are claiming one side of the US and the Cafians, or the Quagintamost, are claiming the other side. Signs from the Book of Nod emerge, turning some of the Camarilla's foundations on their head, and the Gangrel have fucked off to assume the mantle of a large independent clan. It then asks the reader with the header, "What is the Camarilla?" and very cleverly tells them what it is not. It is very quick to address that big old debate of who are the good and bad guys in Vampire. The Cam are usually seen as the good guys, the Sabbat the bad, and the Anarchs are some angsty teens going through their rebellious phase. In V5, this attitude has shifted. The Anarchs to some are the good guys, the Cam the bad, with the Sabbat as the fucking crazies off their tits on God knows what. All of these are wrong. There are no heroes in Vampire the Masquerade, and the Camarilla, unlike the Sabbat and Anarchs, not fully aligned with their ideals besides the concept of upholding the Masquerade. There are no good guys in the world of darkness. Kindness is something to be exploited, as each member is able to find power. The Cam are no better than the Sabbat in many respects. They choose to hide their transgressions. They are the law holding down the lawless, the elders trying to tie down the neonates. In many ways, their faith, or that is essentially what the Camarilla is, makes them far worse than the Sabbat. All of these things are explored within the first few pages of this book, as well as a handy lexicon of current, as of 1999, vulgar and old-form phrases/slang you may hear in the Camarilla. Chapter 1 extends the themes mentioned in the introduction chapter as it presents an overview of the Camarilla. It defines what it is, what it isn't, where it came from, and the direction it currently is going as a revised edition. Of course, it breaks down the various roles found within the Camarilla, starting with the elusive inner circle, which many are rumours placed about them. Are they replaced every 13 years? Do they diabolise the Justicars once their service is up, or do the current Justicars replace them? None of these are confirmed, and provides the ST in question to come up with their own answers, whether it becomes a plot device for some dangerous players in or outside the Justicars' direct jurisdiction. This section of the chapter does plenty of work to remove any doubt the reader may have wanting to buddy up with one of these kindred. In addition, it removes any misconception about the Archon's powers, establishes the Primogen are advisors to the Prince, and so forth. Each of these positions are explained in lengthy yet engaging detail. Information I will skim over in this review, for I have done it plenty of times in various podcast episodes, the most of which being the How to Camarilla episode. There is also a large chunk of the chapter dedicated to unpacking the traditions in beautiful detail. If you think you understand everything regarding the 6 traditions, read this section here. You will learn something, I'm sure. Following this is a chapter about the then 6 clans that made up the core of the Camarilla of the revised edition. The Bruja, Malkavians, Toreador, Tremere, Ventru, and Nosferatu. Deep, thorough information is provided about their organisation, strength, and influence within the Camarilla, as well as the clan's customs and practices, which include their in-clan cultures and who and how they embrace. Anyone familiar with the deep lore of each of these clans won't learn too much here, but the section is useful if they need a brief summary and wants to know how they blend into the Camarilla. It is also handy not having this section written in character, as it avoids any particular biases of said fictional author. This is not me saying that explanations by characters are a bad thing, far from it, but it works better for our guide to have a neutral voice. On that note, it is worth noting that, as of 5th edition, the Bruja are no longer part of the Ivory Tower, and much of the information here may not be so appropriate for most V5 chronicles. Of course, there are exceptions to every rule, and high-standing members of the Camarilla would obviously remain, similar to the Gangrel, who still have their right up here. The chapter also introduces the idea of clan prestige as a background for characters that have a high standing with a particular Camarilla clan, usually their own, own. It's a status that bears no relation to the actual status background and cannot be bought with experience points, demonstrating the weight of such a background. And for that one weird player who desperately wants to shoehorn a Setite, Samadi or Ravnos into the Camarilla, or how a pre-Vermilion wedding Assamite might be adopted, the chapter provides how to play those, as well as the difficulty of playing a Giovanni and the 6 Samitsi that would align themselves with the Camarilla. Whilst it is highly unlikely that said clans would find themselves in the Camarilla, I do appreciate the effort gone into this section, as I'm of the mindset that players should be given the tools to be creative and experiment with the more avant-garde set of ideas. The Daughters of Cacophony are mentioned here too, be it with their transphobic motives before it was retconned in V20. The chapter ends with 3 clans presented in ye olde character creation format, or to be pedantic, a bloodline, a clan, and Kaitiv, the bloodline being the Gargoyles and the clan being the La Sombra Anti-Tribu. It is emphasised that the Kaitiv are disliked and looked down upon with great disgust, a visible sign that the youngest are embracing too much, and I find it interesting that the book suggests the Kaitiv disciplines default to fortitude, potence, and presence if you are unable to come up with the 3 by yourself. The Gargoyles are briefly presented as the rocky automatons we love and know, presenting narrative and player options as a free or slave gargoyle, even presenting the interesting narrative for Prince to have some as bodyguards, or even assassins. Then with the La Sombra Anti-Tribu, they operate almost exactly the same as their Sabbat counterparts, but feel the Camarilla is a better vehicle for that, which of course you will know all about that if you listened to the Lore by Night podcast episode on the La Sombra. Plugs aside, it was a very nice addition to the book. The 3rd chapter is all about character creation, which is a chapter I don't feel I need to go through too much, given the extensive character creation and how-to guides I have done. That being said, this chapter does have some extra flavour if you're trying to build an established member of the Camarilla rather than someone who is just a few months in, for example. The archetypes, merits and flaws presented here are in V20, and there is many a secondary ability to choose from, all of which are rather interesting. Chapter 4 is filled with many advanced disciplines, which, for those of you who are only used to V5, are elder powers that have 6 to 9 dots in a particular discipline. Again, similar to the previous chapter, many of those are in V20, be it with a different or similar name. Likewise, many a Tremere Thaumaturgy path is littered throughout, as well as Viceratakia and Gargoyle's Flight. The chapter ends with combination disciplines, specifically for elder characters, which almost makes them unusable for average play. I say almost, for I'm a huge advocate for every Vampire the Masquerade player and ST doing an elder game at least once. After that is a chapter on tactics and systems, which talks about any and everything that happens in the Camarilla and how to run and include these things. Pre-station, presentation, courts and punishments, permissions to embrace, diablerie, and appropriate punishments for fucking up any of these things, including the stripping of domain, the Lexa Talonis, otherwise known as the Blood Hunt, and much, much more. There is information on the Red List, and the rewards one can gain from dealing with one of the individuals on it, as well as defining with various boons and what their levels mean. Even the topics of war and bending the rules during times of great need, and what happens when shit not only hits the fan, but you swallow 60% of it. For example, the Camarilla have been known to mass embrace mortals in times of great peril, but how does a court deal with that and order such a large mass of vampiric bodies? The answers to this question, and whatever ones you probably have swimming through your brain right now, are answered in this chapter. I know I have been terribly brief with this chapter, hinting at this and that, but this chapter, chapter 5, is a very detailed chapter, with far too much information to talk about in this review, but literally all the what would happen if, and how does X work within the Camarilla are all answered in deep, meaningful ways. The next chapter is perhaps one of the most helpful and vital chapters to any storyteller's arsenal, which is a chapter on how to build your city. Whether it's an actual city that you and your players live in, or a fictional one, chapter 6 goes through all the fiends you would find and probably include in your settings in some capacity or another. It might seem a bit obvious to include a supermarket, bus station or charity, but not every player or ST lives near a city, and those sorts of pointers act as good reminders and aids. I have been using it quite a bit for the games I run in my fictional city of Hemingworth, and it is such a useful guide. One smaller detail I admire is a small box on page 163 reminding the ST that wants to overpopulate the city with weird and wacky bloodlines to not do that, but to treat them as they are, rare oddities whose presence causes much gossip and intrigue, two of the keywords that make up the Camarilla. On the topic of new storytellers, the chapter ends with a huge pool of nameless NPCs filling every position of power in the Camarilla, plus some additional ones that you can discover for yourself. It's great to call upon one of these examples if your players do something totally unexpected and you weren't prepared for it, you're a brand new ST and are feeling unfamiliar with how to go about balancing stats for characters, something that some of the more recent V5 books do dreadfully, or you're an experienced ST that just doesn't have the time and energy to stat your NPCs. It works great for running one-shots and convention games. The penultimate chapter of the book is an expansive storytelling chapter. It details the themes and moods of Camarilla games, both from the perspective of playing the Camarilla or going up against them. I love how many plot ideas and hooks are presented to the reader and how it encourages the reader to incorporate them into everything that they have read thus far. The final chapter is one that I feel should have belonged to the previous chapter, even if it meant making it a big mega Chad chapter. Simply titled Allies, Enemies and Others, Chapter 8 is filled with, well, allies, enemies and others. This includes things like the relationship with the Anarchs, which, as a reminder, were part of the Camarilla for some time, as well as a peek into the culture and any clan members that exist through the lens of a pompous Camarilla vampire. There is a bigger dive into elder vampires in the Camarilla, both overall and looking at how the stereotypical elder of each clan may behave, expanding information presented in previous chapters in great detail, almost as if you are peering back behind an exclusive curtain. It is a particularly interesting section of the chapter on how to use them in games as NPCs when dealing with other vampires and mortals. We also get more than a fair peek of the attitude the Camarilla has of their other supernatural buddies, which basically boils down to they don't, minus a few exceptions, most notably Tremere and Mages and Malkavians with the Changelings. There is also mentioning of the Camarilla's interaction with the Inconnu, as well as an exploration of who and what they are, and for the 3 people listening to this who actually have heard of them, there's actually some Inconnu lore for you. Not much, but there is some. It's understandable, given they are not the focus of this book. The focus is obviously on the machinations of the Ivory Tower, and a lot of information is presented to the reader. Never did it feel overwhelming, even when reading yet another eye-rolling description of the 1990s Malkavian. I know some newer V5 players are scared of the green marble and the misinformation that older/legacy stuff encourages power gaming, but that is simply not true. Your iteration of the Camarilla you love so much comes from this, and many other books. Some of them are bad, some of them are good, but some are great. Guide to the Camarilla, however, exceeds most of these, because this book is a must-own book regardless of which version of the game you're playing. This book contains more information about the Camarilla than any other book in Vampire the Masquerade's history. It is an engagingly written and incredibly informative. Out of all the books I've reviewed, and quite possibly all the books I will ever review on the podcast, this is the only sourcebook you should get if you only have enough money for one sourcebook besides your core book of choice. It will enhance your understanding of Vampire the Masquerade as a whole, the Camarilla, the Anarchs and clans. Most importantly of all, it will improve your role-playing, which is ultimately what it's all about. And for those of you who are new to the Lore by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book 1 vampire for every 100,000 mortals out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.